the information environment and attention that we work in at work is not dissimilar from the one that is outside of that. And so if the creator economy is a big deal in other places, being a creator and having like specific topics and new interesting ways of putting your work in the world becomes more important inside of a company just to gather some more attention and just to build a little bit of influence.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Awkward Silences. Today, we're here with Andrew Hogan, who is the head of insights at Figma. We're very happy to have you here today, Andrew, to talk about the future of design collaboration. So many meaty topics we're going to jump into, and I think you're the right person to do it. So, and it's Friday the 13th, so nothing's going to go wrong. Everything's going to go swimmingly and amazingly. And yeah, so happy to have you here, Andrew.
Glad to be here. I didn't know it was Friday the 13th.
It is. Sorry to break the news.
Thank you.
Yes,
glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
We've got Carol here too.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to dig in. Yeah, both to talk a little about Figma and then all what Figma is learning about and thinking about future of work.
Yeah, lots of meta levels here in terms of, right, learning insights about design. And of course, you're a design collaboration tool. So this will be a lot of fun. But Andrew, you have an interesting background, as many folks in sort of insights and research do. But maybe we could start by just getting a little taste of what got you to your current role.
Yeah, I mean, I was in consulting and we ran some interesting research, and I had started talking about that a little bit publicly. And I thought, well, this is cool. I want to do this more. And then I went to work at Forrester, and I was actually hired to do like digital strategy things, research digital strategy and how that's working. And then you rapidly realize that that's actually a big discussion about design and research, just sort of repackaged in a different way often, and, with different goals and group of people. And then, from there, it was like, well, where else can I do this kind of thing? Who else is interested in talking about the way that design is changing and the way that the industry is changing? And then obviously Figma is a great place to do that and has been really interesting for about the past 3 years.
And then I know that you also became a parent recently, and that factored into a little bit of a side hustle. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
I have 2 kids. I have one daughter that is a little over 3, and then I have another daughter that is 8 months. And I actually delayed my parental leave to work on Config. Those of us who run big company conferences, my wife was out a little longer and we worked that out. And I just love my daughters so much, and it's been such a joy and so interesting. And I feel so privileged and happy to watch them grow up and try to help them grow up. It's just been really cool. The side hustle, it's really overselling it. The hobby, I don't know what it is. It's in there. It's called parent.tech, and it grew out of this realization that like we were not being as intentional with like how the iPad got brought out and with like what we were watching and like what was my daughter doing. And it's like the middle of the pandemic too, so it's a little harder. So I'm trying to be kind to myself and about that. You sort of just do what you need to do. But we realized we really needed to think about what is the role of technology and consumption and creation with technology in our daughter's life going to be, and how should we help her with that? We're on our computers all the time. We're on our phones all the time. I love doing those things. It's given me like a great career and like enhanced my creativity and like, there's all these positives we all have. But we just realized that wasn't happening on purpose, and it wasn't happening with intention. And so I started Parent Tech as really like a selfish excuse to talk to people about how they were parenting around technology and with the challenges, because with every new technology, parenting changes, expectations change, society changes. And so it's just been this great exercise of like learning, well, what are you dealing with when you have an 8-year-old? What about when you have a 14-year-old? What about when you have a 5-year-old? Should you buy, Pock Pock, which is this sort of digital toy thing that I'm kind of obsessed with right now. Really fascinating app that my daughter loves using. how should you think about the time that they have with that versus the time that they have, watching like a Sesame Street? And how should you think about a Sesame Street versus like a Doc McStuffins or all of those things? And I'm a researcher, I just start talking, what is it that works? What are you doing? You have what device? What does that do? Oh, Firewalla. Oh, that's kind of cool. So anyway, it's been a really cool exercise that I started at the end of my parental leave. And I've kind of carried it through, and I feel really good about continuing to do that research and work and talking to people. So if people have ideas, thoughts, I'm into it.
The website is parent.tech. We'll be sure to link it in the show notes. But yes, for those who are listening, who are spending, have kids, spend a lot of time with kids. One thing that I love from reading through it was just the sort of the nuance, right? Like, you're a researcher, so that's a big piece here. But I think the conversation used to be screen time, no screen time, and then adding nuance of like, well, what are they doing with the screen? And how does that help their imagination, creativity? Really fun to see. Yeah, I'm also the parent of a 3-year-old, so excited to learn more. Let's jump over to Figma. So I'm sure many of our listeners use Figma day to day. So maybe we'll just start with your role. So you're the head of insights at Figma. What does that mean? And then tell us a little bit of how it fits in with the other functions.
Yeah. So the head of insights at Figma means that I'm doing research about where the industry is going, what challenges are happening, how are different kinds of companies tackling those challenges. I work really closely with our research team to, run studies that we might run internally, or we might commission from outside groups, which I'll talk about a couple of those later. There's just something so interesting about taking a step back and doing this like meta look at where is this industry going? What are some of the issues that it faces? Who are the people and the actors that are involved? This is a research, focused research, sort of product focused podcast, but like those people are integral in the design process too. And so are designers. And there's not even just one kind of designer either. There's like a whole stack of, and so it just makes it this really interesting thing to get to talk about publicly based on research. And it's been cool to build and to work on over the last 3 years as we work on that.
Amazing. So I know you'll talk a little bit more about some of the methods and projects that you've taken on. Would you consider this sort of like big strategic research, market research? Yeah. And I know you're working with research teams. Like, how do all these kinds of research, I guess, fit together at Figma?
Yeah. It's always evolving, right? Like, these things are always changing. I do think we're thinking about like, what is the role of like software spend in this? And how does software spend then translate into, the actions and activities that we do? Everyone's favorite topic, digital transformation. Is that over? Is it continuing? Has it been supplanted by generative AI transformation? And the goal is always to like, you don't do the study that ends with like 75% of companies are digitally transforming. You try to end with something that helps somebody do their job better or think about the world differently, because that's always the risk with this sort of, like, people call it thought leadership, which is kind of want to roll my eyes a little bit at that.
Don't we all?
Yeah. But you want to help people see a different perspective and view on the world. We're all trying to make sense of this because we only have our little view. How do you expand it out? And it's just doing the same things with a different kind of scope.
So a couple questions on how you're researching before we get into what you're learning. One, when you say industry, is it design? Is it tech? Like, what is the scope of what you're looking at? And then, how do you understand it?
I mean, this is how big is design? Design is huge. Design has many different disciplines and facets to it, and activities and definitions. I think Figma is largely thinking through the role of software in the world and software in the activities that we do, the things that we buy, what we, the parenting, like what has been, it's all of those things. I do think there's some bounds that are always offered by that. But how many things do you do that don't involve like some level of screen mediated interaction or planning or activity? And so you rapidly get to, how does this impact travel? So we've done some series on like, how is travel being redesigned? How is retail being redesigned? How are financial services being redesigned? Because our relationship with banks is, and as you get to people who are just entering banking now, their relationship with a bank is wildly different than our relationship. I remember going into a branch to deposit a check. That's like it's a very foreign concept for many people now. So I think we're always trying to find like, where are the bounds of this and how should we scope it? Because it can rapidly spiral out of control. And one of the challenges in any research project is like, what are we really answering here? And how do we not just, 75% of companies are transforming?
Right. So yeah, digital transformation is what you kind of kicked off with. And then quickly, we started talking about AI, and I imagine, right, with Figma being for sort of screen design, right? And then we expand out to digital, and now we're talking about AI. Where does the screen fit into this?
We don't necessarily think about it just as screen design, because software is such a big part of how people complete activities in their everyday life. And so I think most companies who are doing this work are also like, what is happening before and after, which is the role of like research often reveals those things. And then that's often where you find like, what are the emotional components to this? What is the meaning that we're trying to help someone create? And it becomes more than just like what is on the screen. It's also the before and afters and the feelings, and how do you evoke those things, or maybe tamp them down if they're things like anxiety. So it's just like the screen is like never just the screen. And then there's also, how does it get built? Because when you hand stuff to developers without any sort of conversation, all kinds of things happen. They're their own creative people who have ideas about how things should work. And so we're always trying to figure out, how do we communicate well, and how do we help teams communicate well across, from designer to developer, from product to developer, from researcher to designer to researcher to, you end up in this, where does all this happen and how do we help it to all happen better so that something great can happen on the other side? And you end up in the same problem of like, how do you scope this down into something that's helpful for someone who's trying to understand the industry, whatever it is, or a particular problem or challenge that they have?
Got it. So the scope is large. We're talking about design and design's relation to software. And then software has a big role, as you said, in all of our day-to-day activities. And then you also mentioned the relationship between design and other teams that they work with. Our listeners will be interested in, how do you actually approach this research, right? It seems very broad. Maybe you have an example research project or something. How do you actually approach that on a day-to-day?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mentioned we did a series on like redesigning finance and redesigning retail. So that was getting really specific about those challenges. We also ran a study that I'm really proud of that, we'll obviously come back to, how products that are powered by generative AI or have like a really strong generative AI component to them, what is that process like, and what do designers and developers think about their involvement in those projects? Because that's obviously a hot topic, except it's almost like cascading down, right? Do the generative AI thing. We need the generative AI features coming down from C level. Are they proud of it? And so we found like 1/3 were not proud, only 1/3 were proud of what they had shipped to date. And so we'll come back to that study, because that's always interesting when you can trend. We'll come back to that study and we'll see if, has generative AI kind of run out of steam? I don't think that it has. But are people more proud? Are they more likely to be proud than they were before? And, what do they think of as the role of, design and design activities within creating those kinds of products? The process is not the same, but it still involves people with unique expertise collaborating together to get to something great at the end, which is kind of different than maybe what people would assume. Oh, generative AI is changing everything. And then the reality is that it's actually designers, developers, researchers working really closely together to figure out the best thing that they could make. So a couple different flavors of studies, some, industry vertical specific generative AI. And then we even ran a really, really cool one with Artifact, which is a research and design consultancy that some folks may know, about generative AI's effect on collaborative work, because that's often something that has not been thought of as changing as much with generative AI, how we work together and how we make decisions. And so we ran a study there as well, which had some interesting findings.
Speaking of collaboration, so I know Figma is a big part of how lots of teams do lots of different kinds of research. And I'm guessing you have a unique set of insights about how that works. So maybe you could talk us a little bit about how you see Figma showing up either in your own research or, in the broader world of how folks are collaborating around research.
People often think about it as, well, we're going to put the thing in front of people, in front of users, and they're going to react to it. And then what's interesting about this is how many, what happens after that? Do you go into FigJam and do you react to different findings? Do people have more questions? How do you get those questions out of the team? How do you get a pulse check on whether people actually agree with the findings or whether they have doubt that they're just maybe not voicing, which if you're not in the same room is actually really hard to figure out. So you look for other cues, like do you create like alignment scales to talk about it? So we see a lot of things like that happening in FigJam where there's like a readout, a discussion, some sort of prompt to just elicit a little more involvement about the findings. And then of course sometimes you have to convince people of things. And so there's where something like slides comes in, Figma slides, where, what's the story that we want people to sort of take away, a little bit more of a one-way presentation and a little bit less participatory. And so you see teams finding the right kind of like mode for that. What are we trying to convince people of something? Are we trying to hear their perspective and get alignment? There's all these different activities that even go beyond, you put the prototype in front of a user and they have a response. And that, the confluence of those different factors is what's really interesting, because we have so many more tools than we did before to try to make this happen. And then the role of the individual doing this work is to try to create the conditions for that collaboration to happen within, whatever power systems sort of exist within the company or context already exists. And we find that Figma is a really useful tool for doing some of those things in addition to, here's the prototype, walk through it and tell us what you're finding.
Right. So as it's a collaboration forward tool, right? And so the prototypes would be the obvious use case in a research context. Then you're talking about using the FigJam more on the like analysis and processing and even the presenting of insights potentially side of things. Did that all kind of happen organically as more folks started collaborating around using Figma in their research workflows? Or is that by design or that kind of back and forth loop?
I don't know the answer of whether it was fully by design from the beginning. I will say, FigJam was created because people were doing it in Figma design. They were making their own stickies. They were, so if you go back to sort of like the early days of that, I think Mahika has done some presentations and discussion of that in other places, one of our PMs. And then the Figma slides is the same sort of thing where they're making slides in Figma. How do we make this easier for them? How do we kind of help with more of the process too? Because it is hard to switch in between different tools and kind of stitch it all together. I don't think we would say like, oh, you can never leave Figma. You can never leave any of these products. I think it's just trying to make it a little simpler for the different behaviors that people are already doing that are all part of this process of all of us, collaboration, this giant word, is a set of activities. How do we kind of support those activities in ways that we see people already kind of going into? Developers are another direction. They were already in Figma design. They were already doing things with Figma design. How do we help them do what they're trying to do better instead of kind of like, kind of piecing it together?
We had a podcast or a webinar not so long ago, and one of the things that came up a lot was this idea of burning the research report, right? The idea that there are lots of different ways to share insights. One is creating another prototype, one is something more collaborative, FigJam, and then, slides where the readout is like just one way that we might, take action from research. Yeah, so it's fun to think that we can do all that in Figma, right?
It's so interesting how you as I don't know, you're told to do X job. And what are the things that fit into X job? You almost have to like craft them into what you think will work best and like use, almost stitch the tools together. And it's not like use this small set of tools anymore. Now you have this giant bucket of tools and techniques and tactics, especially because it's not just, in person anymore, right? It's very, the screens mediate a lot of these things.
All right, I think we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I think we're going to now get into some of the details of these studies that you've done, right? I think we're going to talk about three, one on AI, one on collaboration, and one on design leadership. And yeah, we'd just love to hear some of the trends. So we'll start with AI. You already sort of previewed that a little bit, but you did some deep dives to think about how AI is changing the workplace and collaboration. Yeah, would love to hear what you learned.
I mean, this was an amazing collaboration with Shane on our research team. We were interested in the products that were being built that were being powered by AI. How are they being done? How are they being designed? And like, how did people feel about how that process was going and about their potential impact? So I teased, only a third were proud of what they had built. I don't have a data point on how many are proud of the things that they build in general. So it's funny, like, that this is a weakness in your study and you just like feel it every time. But I think only a third being proud is a little bit, that seems low to me, right? Most of them thought that things were going to change pretty significantly over the next 12 months. So we're coming up on 12 months. And it'll be interesting to see, how that's changed. We also, it was so meta because are you using AI to design the thing that is AI? Or are you designing a thing without AI? Anyway, it was such a funny survey challenge that, again, I'm really happy I worked with Shane on that one, because you had to like disambiguate all of these different parts of it. And I still think that there was probably some bleed over where people were thinking about things they had used AI for instead of thinking about, oh, I'm designing something that is, maybe agentive, or I'm designing something that generates images, or, they were thinking about, oh, I generate images in my process, therefore I'm designing. Anyway, it's one of those tricks that you always have within research and I think we'll probably do it a little differently this coming time around.
With everything with AI too, I think it's the case that, and only in 5-10 years, however many years, will we know where we are and whatever the curve looks like, right? To your point about the 1/3. Is it just that we're in the early stage of the curve and people haven't sort of figured out how to work with it yet? Is it that, what is the promise of AI going to look like? Of course, none of us knows, right? But I think expectations were from where I said, like a combination of very high and then skeptical too. I think you saw a lot of both, right? And so it feels like the hype has calmed down and almost like a little bit of not a starting over, but a reset. So it'll be very, very interesting to see where we end up.
My favorite conclusion from this was not a data point. It was actually the discovery that I think I had bumped into before of Amara's law, which is that, we always overestimate how much things will change in the short term. We underestimate how much they will change in the long term. And it's just a reminder of, people thought there'd be significant change over the next year. And I think if you've been following like the digital transformation sort of world, it takes a long time to really shift, how people work, what they build, all of these other things that are, I would argue, these huge parts of work and life. That, go beyond, can you generate an image? Can you write you a first draft of your, email? There's just so much else that is untouched and will be for quite some time.
How is it impacting collaboration, or how do you see, AI impacting collaboration in the near term?
So we saw a pretty big difference between how many people said it had significantly transformed the way they collaborated. So we asked, like, how has it transformed the products that you've worked on? How has it transformed your company strategy? And then, like, how has it transformed the way you work with others? And there was a big gap between those things. And I think we probably intuitively knew that would be the case. But by and large, meetings are mostly unchanged. It like transcribes things. It suggests, like, oh, these are the topics. This is the agenda. And I think for, some sales purposes, it's probably been more significant. But we actually commissioned a study with Artifact. So that the research and design agency, about how this could change how we collaborate in the future. They were doing a little bit of like, futuristic, like where's this going? And we used a Jambot, which is a widget that was built as part of an internal, we do these maker weeks, which is sort of like a hackathon at Figma. And the widget had been built originally for that. It was obviously, upgraded and fully, put out there, and it was put out in beta. And so this Jambot way of using generative AI shows people what other people are prompting and sort of the chain. So it's a more collaborative way of kind of prompting together. And so we tested that with a couple different groups. And the most interesting finding from this study is that the groups that were, when they were using generative AI in their session, they talked 40% more. What we believe is that it actually just injected a bunch of energy into these processes, even in places where maybe it wasn't needed. For groups, it wasn't needed. These were product development teams, like, teams of designers, developers, PMs. And so it was kind of interesting to see 40% more talking is actually a lot. That's like what is being lost, like doing, like synthesizing, like it almost became, we kind of had this analogy around energy. It almost became, there was this great quote about like, it's like a bucking horse. You get on and like, maybe you hang on and maybe you get thrown off. And it's just a reminder of how hard it is to change the way we work together and how many different norms and kind of expectations are there. That's different than like, can you generate an image or can you generate something that looks like an essay?
Right. When you're using your AI as a personal assistant, it's like, do the thing, it does the thing. Now I'm more productive. And then I'll go talk about it with someone else. When it's entered into the group chat, it's like, who invited this guy to the party? What is going on now? So maybe a more complicated dynamic in the short term. So I know you do a lot of research on how different teams work together, design, product, how they work together inside and outside of Figma. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about your collaboration research.
The core of this was a study with Forrester. So Forrester Research, where I used to work. I got a chance to do that. This was really about comparing almost pre-pandemic behaviors to, like, I don't know about post-pandemic, but like, certainly the things had kind of normalized to some extent. And that study was interesting because it basically revealed like there's like new ways that you have to build credibility and influence and almost think about the ways in which you work together. And like, it wasn't, I'll give you an example. When you walk into a room, you can sort of tell something about somebody's manner, how their day is, how things are going. When you look at their, where they're at on Slack, unless they've literally put something in there, you don't see it. And the messages, like I had leaders for around the study telling me like, yeah, I think a lot about what emojis I'm going to put in the Slack message, because this is the primary way people are going to interact. I think a lot about performing on camera, because I am essentially like performing. This is like a broadcast. And that study was interesting because it just revealed, even though like return to office sort of initiatives are happening, you still convey so much meaning through interactions that are, video or chat than you did before. And you've lost some of these other kinds of other ways in which you used to determine what was going on. So it was a super interesting study. And we kind of put out a headline that like work has changed. Because I think for many people that they hadn't sort of recognized that was the case, and there were some new tools and expectations that maybe they had.
And so a piece of what you're saying is, even if you're not a fully remote company or you do have time in office, even then some of the patterns, the habits that we have and how we communicate might be maintained from a time where we were fully remote. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know, it was again sort of meta about work in general.
And is it, you focus on designers specifically? Was there anything that really stood out in the design world?
It's interesting because in that sort of world, being able to make a high quality visual to communicate an idea is really important. And being able to sort of like help people see the future and visualize the future can help rally people who are otherwise their attention is split across all the different tools where they work. You have this thing that you can put everyone looking at and then center the discussion around that thing. And so that's not like, I don't have a data point, like, oh, that became 50% more important. I just have this qualitative sense that somehow that became even more essential for more people in the process too, who were trying to communicate visually, not in the sense of like, I made this infographic, but in the sense that like, I have this concept or this idea, and we can all rally around and look at this.
What are some of the other ways that work has changed?
We hinted a little bit at like the software creation and the importance of software. If all of your interactions at work are through screens and different tools, that obviously makes those things really important. And then the part that's outside of the tools themselves is like, we are all creating content. We are all content creators, and sometimes you want to put content in the world to like almost convey a bigger message. Like, I have a pulse on this particular topic, or I have knowledge of this, or I have experience of this. In some sense, parent tech is kind of that same thing where like, I have an interest in this topic. I'm going to put it out in the world, and then you are going to react and tell me things. And we are going to have a different kind of conversation than we would have had if I hadn't made that. And so one interesting thing that we did at Figma is we actually had this internal podcast newsletter thing called Figbrew that I worked on with some of the research team for quite a while. We're a little bit on hiatus now. I'm still catching up from being out. And we've made it an external interview series too. So you can see that on figma.com/Figbrew. The act of making it also brought us together to talk about topics, and then putting it out there then caused other people to see it and then have feelings and reactions and other things. And so I think there's just this, the information environment and attention that we work in at work is not dissimilar from the one that is outside of that. And so if the creator economy is a big deal in other places, and being a creator is a big deal in other places, being a creator and having like specific topics and new interesting ways of putting your work in the world becomes more important inside of a company, just to gather some more attention. And just to build a little bit of influence.
Yeah. And my background, marketing, I've done content my whole career. Back before there were content creators, it was right. It's like, let's make some content on the socials, which is what we're doing now. But a challenge of any kind of content, to your point, is standing out, because there is a whole lot of content out there. So I'm not sure if your research, placed a value judgment on this, but I am curious what it learned in terms of like the cognition of the person processing all of this content by which we share our opinions and test them out and dialogue around them. How do we... is anyone suffering, I don't know, information overload?
Yeah. And so it's funny, we also did another study with the Design Executive Council about how leaders are responding to this, particularly design leaders. And one of their essential roles is as a clarifier. So, just like an entrepreneur looking for opportunities, a visionary, putting like something out there in the world for us to aim at, and then a unifier. And that's where that sort of visualization comes in. And leaders are especially design leaders, but I think leaders of all kinds are recognizing people need to know what to focus on and where to go. And they can convey that through like a strong, powerful visual. I think that has implications whether you're leading like a project or whether you're leading a company. And there's many ways and tools of doing that. We didn't get into like which are the most effective. I know that design leaders love to put like a product concept out there that works really well and feels really good. And then that's like the core technique that they tend to use. So that was an interesting study with the Design Executive Council, which is, it's the kind of thing we love to work on and share.
Yeah, so let's we spent another minute on this study. So it's called Strategic Behaviors and Mindsets of Design Executives. And you mentioned sort of like three major, is it behaviors or mindsets? that design executives might have. Can you take us through more of them in detail and then maybe, share more on each?
So the entrepreneur is looking for opportunities, and this is the idea that if you are a C-level design executive, you are a design leader, but you're also a business leader. So where is the company going? What should they be thinking about? What should they be looking at? What risks exist out there? So being an entrepreneur means looking for that and then trying to push that forward instead of waiting for somebody to give it to you. The visionary is the idea of pushing your team and other teams further, thinking about the quality bar and thinking about where things should be going for them to be good. And then the strategic unifier is just like, there's so many initiatives, there's so many priorities. Someone has a brand house, and then they also there's so many pieces. And if you are a design leader, if you are a design executive, telling people this is the most important thing for us to be doing, and then commit, staying after it, because that's the hard part, right? This is the priority for these 3 months, and then this other thing is the priority for these 6 months, and then and I think that's those things were essential mindsets and ways of working for these leaders.
And I know this study profiles different leaders. Do we find all of these mindsets exist in each leader, or do some sort of tend to lean on one more than another?
I think there's a spikiness for sure. It wasn't, the study wasn't designed to, be like a powerful quantitative study. It was designed to be, how can we qualitatively get a sense of what is changing, what is new, what is unchanged? And I think there's certainly spikiness of people who see their role as looking for business opportunity, people who see their role as looking for, how can we make the most, sort of good in the world by creating change? And I don't think you have to be great at all of them. I think you have to think about all of them, though.
Any spiked as more important than the others, but it's not so much that. This is what you're seeing in effective design leaders at this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you cannot be disconnected from company priorities, and you cannot ignore the people need to know where to go. And, that has to be in lockstep with the group around you. If it's not, that's a problem, and that's a risk. Rachel Kobetz at PayPal has talked about the importance of being connected to your sort of first team, which is, the group that immediately is on the same level. Yeah. So, but I think all of those are important.
Across all of this research, having thought about design and collaboration and AI and all these big, exciting things, I don't know, is there something you're most nervous about, excited about as you think about, the couple of years or so ahead?
Amara's law, we underestimate what will change in the long term is one of the most interesting ways of thinking about this. When the mobile craze started, right? You guys remember SOLOMO, social, local, mobile. Anyway, that was a phrase that was thrown around for a while. That all starts, and somehow 5 years later, you're calling a car to wherever you are, and it has solved this huge problem that many of us faced. It has, transformed the world, the spread and proliferation of mobile technologies, to where I'm starting a parenting site to try to understand what do I need to know that I don't know. And I think that is really interesting, progress and change, and how it's always happened. I actually went back to a bunch of different history books around the role of technology in societies and how it's changed. And I found an example from the clock. There's a book by Mumford, Technics and Civilization, from pre-World War II. The way that he talks about the clock is that, first you could keep the time, and then you tried to save the time, and then you were serving the time. You were how, your relationship with time changed because of the invention of the clock. But how many centuries did that take? Anyway, that sort of stuff makes me really intrigued.
Well, that's a great segue into our rapid fire section, I think. So maybe you could tell us about some of your favorite books, some favorite resources, thinkers, people you follow.
I mean, I mentioned history. There's a couple. There's Technics and Civilization was a tough read, I'm going to be honest. So I would maybe use some AI assistance to work through that.
Tough in that way, dense.
tough. It was dense, not even in the way I like dense. Like the other examples I was thinking about here were like Rise and Fall of American Growth, which is like, he looks at like sweet potato consumption over time as a way of tracking change, which I just thought was fascinating. The general idea is that things change dramatically for the period like through the Civil War. And then they actually haven't changed as much over the last like 70, 80 years, which is kind of counter to the narrative that many of us would think about. And this is just Rise and Fall of American Growth. So he didn't have data from other places. But it just really helps to take a step back and look at the moment that we're in versus other moments that have happened. So, that's like almost one class. Another thing that's interesting is Jeffrey Pfeffer, who's a Stanford professor, and, he has these books on power. It's just interesting to know like what the different levers are and how to think about it. And then I'm always just intrigued by what, Ben Thompson at Stratechery or Craig Maud is doing. What are they creating? And how are they kind of almost thinking about the world? And the thing that always comes to mind here is there's that clip of someone just saying like, you can just do stuff. You can, and clearly that's ignoring that there are risks and, privileges and other things like that. It's a really interesting way of like, these people have just built things that they're proud of because they wanted to, and they figured out a way to do it. And I just think that's really interesting.
Some good resources. Again, we'll link to all these in the show notes as well. What's your favorite interview question?
I like tell me about the last time you did X. I don't have a better one. This is the most ridiculous suggestion. But I like that because most of business research is so abstract that you're like, tell me about your digital transformation initiatives. What are they going to say? But tell me about the last time you tried to do, launch a new website. Tell me about the last time that you tried to run a research project. And then from there, you can go a lot of different places because it's so specific. And I'm sorry, I don't have a cooler one. I was struggling with this last night, to be honest.
It's not about making the interviewer look cool. It's about getting good insights, right? And to your point, I think, not only are you talking about actual things that happen, which is always better than hypothetical would, you, should, you, could you, but you get some emotional responses too, right? Of talking through memories. Are you active? We talked about your parent tech site. We'll link other places you're active online. LinkedIn.
I like LinkedIn. I am firmly in the I like LinkedIn camp.
You said it here.
I said
you told the world.
I'm telling the world.
Yep.
Other people have questions, and I just like that it is attached to real people's names. And I can almost know like part of why people are coming to a particular conclusion. And I like that. It's more context.
Yeah, I like LinkedIn too. There's some, there's mileage may vary in terms of thought leadership quality, but I like it. It tends to be a short form and you can get some nuggets. And yeah, what were you going to say?
Follow people.
Like
it was a big unlock for me when I realized I could treat it like Twitter. I could just follow people that I thought were interesting. I don't need to connect to everybody.
Yeah, and you can unfollow them too, where it's like, I get it.
Also,
I get your beat.
Also,
I'm on to the next thing. Yeah.
Key insight.
And if people are following you, are there any upcoming studies that people should be aware of, looking out for, things that you're publishing soon?
We're always launching things, and I am just like looking forward to next year and, putting a lot of interesting things into the world.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. This has been a lot of fun. I'm excited for the future, and it's always fun to check back in on these future-leaning episodes and see where things end up in a couple of years, because we'll know more then. But thanks again for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me on.